When you're building applications in Node, one of the most common tasks that you're going to have to do is integrate with another API, integrate with some third party. When tasked with this, many developers will need to go to that third party and look for a Node.js library that they provide, or look for a Node.js or NPM library that someone else has written for interacting with that API. But there is another way to integrate. You can simply craft HTTP messages or HTTPS messages and send them off to the third-party API. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to do that. For this app, we want to integrate with Twilio. And Twilio, if you haven't heard of it, allows you to provision and manipulate phone numbers in order to take and receive calls or take and receive SMS messages or video calls, anything like that. So we're going to use Twilio to send the SMS alerts to our users, telling them if their checks are up or down. And so before we do that full integration, we'd like to write a little library that integrates with Twilio and allows us to send an SMS message. So I'm going to go to the helpers file. I'm going to start crafting a little function that will let us send an SMS via Twilio. So I'm going to call this helpers.send Twilio SMS, and it's going to be a function that takes in a phone number that we need to send to, the message that we want to send, which would be a string, and a callback. The first thing that the function is going to want to do is validate the parameters. So we're going to say that the phone number should be a string, and it should have the length of 10 or default to false. The message should also be a string, with a length greater than 0, and a length smaller than or equal to 1600, because that's the max amount of characters we can send through an SMS on Twilio. And before I forget, this is a little typo. There we go. All right, so we have the two parameters that would have come in, and we want to say that if phone and message continue on, otherwise we're going to call back the error using the error back pattern. Given parameters were missing or invalid. But if everything was fine, we want to configure the request payload that we're going to send to Twilio. Since this course is not about writing Twilio apps, I'm not going to go through the Twilio docs in detail. I'll just briefly mention how this integration works. We're going to send a payload to Twilio. We're going to have to send it to api.twilio.com as a post, and we're going to send it to an account/messages endpoint with certain headers, and that will automatically send an SMS message to the number that we specified. So when crafting this payload, we're going to say that payload equals from, it's going to equal config Twilio from phone. So we're going to add an object to our config called Twilio, and it's going to have a key on it called from phone, which is the sender phone that we are using. We want to say to is going to be whatever number is provided plus the country code. we're going to say that the body is whatever the message is. So this payload needs to get sent to Twilio. So now we want to stringify the payload and then configure the request details. So we are going to use the query string module to stringify this payload as opposed to JSON stringifying, which means above we're going to need to require query string. While we're up here, we are going to have to send a request to an HTTPS endpoint. So we know that we are going to need the HTTPS module. The HTTP and HTTPS modules are pretty versatile. Not only do they contain functions that let you start an HTTP or HTTPS server, but they also contain functions that let you craft and send off HTTP or HTTPS requests. So since we need to talk to an HTTPS endpoint, we're going to use the HTTPS module, which is the same module that we used when we were creating our HTTPS server. Now we need to create the request details, which contains all the information about the HTTPS request that we are about to send off. So the protocol, as I mentioned, is going to be HTTPS. The host name is going to be api.twilio.com. The method is going to be capital post. The path is going to be this long Twilio path, which is just how their API works. 2010, 04, 01. That is an API version of theirs. Accounts, /. Then we're gonna end this string and put in a Twilio account ID. So Twilio.account SID. And then start the string back up with another / and then messages.json. Okay. Now we need to include an authentication header for basic HTTP authentication. So that is going to be config.twilio.account SID, as it was a moment ago, then a colon, and then config.twilio.auth token. So now you can see that this Twilio object we're creating is going to have at least 3 parameters: a from phone, an account SID, and an auth token. Now we're going to explicitly state the other headers that we need to declare. We need to say that content type is going to be application/x www form URL encoded. This is not a JSON API. This is a more traditional API, and so we are going to need to send it as this content type instead of a JSON content type. And rather than JSON stringifying it, that is why we query stringified it, because we need to make it more like a normal form being posted. Lastly, the content length, something we need to declare explicitly. And to get the length, we're going to use the buffer module, which is not something that you need to declare as a dependency at the top. It's just a global available to you. We're going to say that buffer byte capital length string payload. So this function is going to get the byte length of this stringified payload that we query stringified and that's just a function available on the buffer module, which is why we're invoking buffer. So that is the entire request details object. Now we need to create a request and then send it off. So we're going to instantiate the request object by declaring it that var request equals HTTPS, that module we required, dot request, and then we're going to pass it in the request details. So we stringified a payload, we created a bunch of HTTPS request details. Now we're using HTTPS.request to actually send off all those details. And it's going to pass us back a response object. Within the response, when the response comes back, we want to grab the status of the sent request. That'll tell us if it was successful or not. So the status is going to equal response res.status code. Now we want to call back to our original caller successfully if the request went through. So we want to say if status equals 200 or status equals 201, either one is fine. We want to call back false. Calling back false because we're using the error back pattern and there is no error. Otherwise, we want to call back status code returned was, and then just tell them whatever it was. All right, so that is the request object, and that is what is going to happen when the request comes back. But now we actually need to send the request off. Right before we do that, we need to do two other things. We need to bind to an error event in case an error happens. Then we need to add the payload, the string payload. Then we need to actually send off the request. So bind to the error event so it doesn't get thrown. We don't want any error to kill the thread. So we're going to say that request on error. So when the request that we created emits an event called error, or if it emits an event called error, we want to invoke this function, which will simply call back the error to our requester. Now we want to add the payload to the request, which is done in a separate step. So we're going to say request rec.write and then add the string payload. All right. Lastly, we want to end the request. And ending the request is the same as sending it off. So we want to say rec end. Once we do that, once the application hits this point, is actually going to send the request off, and when the request comes back, it's going to invoke what happens inside of there. So the callback could either get called because an error happened or because it came back with a status code. Now before this works, we need to go to our config file and add all those Twilio parameters that we mentioned. So we're going to say that Twilio is itself an object, and inside of that it has account SID, it has auth token, and it has from phone. Now there are two ways that you can get the values that you want to put in here. You could sign up for a Twilio account and they will provide you staging tokens that you can use without having to pay for anything. And they will give you a staging account SID, a staging auth token, and they'll let you choose which from phone you want to use. Or you can just go into the GitHub that is linked on this lecture and look at the code that we've been writing, and the account SID and auth token will be provided there, and you can just copy it in. Copying it in is exactly what I'm going to do. And there we go. That came straight from our GitHub, and you're welcome to use these as well. Now I'm going to modify our index.js to invoke this helper so that we can see that the send Twilio SMS function that we just wrote actually works. So I'm going to go back to index, and right at the top, get rid of this. I'm going to say helper.send Twilio SMS. Now I'm going to just make up a number here, 415 123 4567, and it should receive the message, hello. Then we're going to log out the error. All right, so let's start this up. Okay, looks like we have a little syntax error when we're setting the content length. We should not have terminated it with a semicolon. So I'm going to go back to index and try this again. It looks like I made another typo when I was crafting this, and that is that the HTTPS must have a colon on it. Similarly, if you were doing the HTTP protocol, you would need to use a colon as well. All right, let's try again. The status code that we got back was 400, which likely meant that this phone number we used was not valid. So let's use one that is more likely to be real. Let's say reference that old 1980s song 8375309 and try that. All right, this was the error, false. So had we been using real production Twilio credentials, Twilio would have sent off a real SMS to this number. Since we're using test credentials that we got from Twilio for free, it's just telling us that there was no error, and had this been production, the SMS would have sent for real. If you do go to Twilio and get credentials of your own, go ahead and place them here for your staging credentials, and for your production credentials, place them down there. All right, so I'm just gonna get rid of this since it's working. Kill the server. And now we have a library that can send SMS, so we can move on to the next level.